The air inside the courthouse was thick with tension. The scent of polished wood, old paper, and stale coffee lingered as people hurried through the marble hallways. Lawyers clutching case files, anxious defendants awaiting their fate, uniformed officers maintaining order. Officer Lauren Mitchell stood near the entrance of courtroom 5, her arms crossed over her chest, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. With over 15 years in law enforcement, she prided herself on spotting trouble before it started. To her, criminals had a certain look, a way of carrying themselves, one she claimed to recognize instantly. More often than not, that look belonged to black men. She adjusted the grip on her belt, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Another day of keeping order. Another day of making sure people knew who was in control. Then she saw him. A tall, well-dressed black man in a charcoal suit strode through the courthouse doors. His posture was upright, movements deliberate, exuding quiet confidence. He wasn't in handcuffs, he wasn't flanked by a lawyer, and he didn't look lost or nervous like most men who walked in here. Mitchell's instincts kicked in. Something was off. She stepped forward, cutting off his path before he could go any further. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Can I help you with something?" The man stopped, his deep brown eyes meeting hers, calm, steady, unshaken. There was no fear, no hesitation, just patience, as if he had been expecting this. "I don't believe I need help," he replied smoothly. Mitchell narrowed her eyes. "Then what are you doing here?" The man let out a quiet exhale, almost amused by her question. "I have an appointment." That wasn't good enough. Everyone in this courthouse had an appointment, with a judge, a lawyer, or a probation officer, but something about him made her uneasy. "What kind of appointment?" she pressed. The man tilted his head slightly, still maintaining his composure. "I don't see how that's relevant to you, officer." Mitchell stiffened. People usually answered quickly when confronted by an officer. Most tried to avoid confrontation. But not him. She took a step closer, closing the space between them, invading his personal bubble. "It becomes relevant when someone like you is walking around a courthouse without explaining why." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed the man's face. Not fear, not anger, something else, a quiet calculation. "Someone like me," he echoed. His voice was low, controlled. Mitchell crossed her arms. "I've been in law enforcement a long time. I can tell when someone doesn't belong, and you don't belong here." The courthouse hallway grew noticeably quieter. A few people slowed their steps, their ears tuning in. The man gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if carefully considering his next move. Then he reached into his suit pocket. Mitchell's hand flew to her holster. "Don't move," she snapped. Gasps rippled through the hallway. A security officer nearby stiffened. A young lawyer standing by dropped his folder, papers scattering across the floor. The man froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. A dangerous silence filled the space between them. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I'm just taking out my wallet." The tension was suffocating. Mitchell's pulse pounded, her training screaming at her to act. But the man wasn't afraid. And that made her even more uneasy. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courthouse hallway, but for Marcus Reed, this wasn't new. The tension, the misplaced suspicion, the hand hovering too close to a gun. It was a story he had seen play out too many times. He wasn't always an FBI agent. Once he had worn a different badge, one he had believed in, one he had fought for. 6 years ago. The summer heat pressed down on the city, making the asphalt shimmer under the sun. Fresh out of the academy, Marcus adjusted his brand new uniform, the fabric still stiff from lack of wear. His first day on patrol, his first real step into the world of law enforcement. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the police weren't heroes, they were threats. He had seen the fear in his mother's eyes when officers stopped his father for no reason. He had watched his older brother learn to speak carefully around cops, to avoid sudden movements, to comply without question. But Marcus had believed he could be different. He had believed he could change the system from within. He was wrong. It didn't take long for reality to set in. At first it was the little things, the casual remarks in the locker room, the offhand jokes about keeping the streets clean. Then it was the traffic stops. Marcus watched as his fellow officers, particularly Lauren Mitchell, stopped black drivers at an alarmingly high rate, their reasons flimsy at best: a broken taillight, a suspicious lane change, a look they didn't like. And when those drivers protested, when they asked why they were being pulled over, it always escalated. It always ended the same way. One night, he saw it happen up close. A 17-year-old black boy, Jamal Taylor, was pulled over for a broken taillight. Marcus had barely glanced at the kid's ID before his partner, Officer Harris, yanked open the door. "Get out of the car." Jamal's hands went up instantly. "I didn't do anything." Harris grabbed his arm. "What are you reaching for?" Panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. Marcus saw it in the kid's eyes. He wasn't reaching for anything. His hands were still in the air. But Harris's hand was already on his gun. Marcus moved before he could think. He stepped between them, blocking Harris. "Stand down." Harris glared. "Move, Reed." "I don't see a threat," Marcus said, his voice even, measured. "Let him go." A tense silence, the kind that could turn deadly in an instant. Then Harris scoffed, shoving Jamal back into the car. "You'll learn, rookie," he muttered. "They're all threats." The words sank in like a blade. Not criminals, not lawbreakers, just they. That night, Marcus stared at himself in the mirror. For the first time, he wondered if he could do this. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, he refused to turn a blind eye. He refused to laugh at the racist jokes, refused to ignore misconduct. And in return, his colleagues stopped having his back. His promotions never came. The whispers grew louder. He was too soft, not a team player, one of them. And then came Lauren Mitchell. He had seen her reports, the stops, the excessive force, the complaints that never went anywhere. She wasn't just part of the system, she was protected by it. And when he finally had enough, when he filed a formal complaint, he found himself on the wrong side of internal affairs. The message was clear. If he wanted justice, he wasn't going to find it here. So he walked away. But he didn't leave law enforcement, because before he turned in his badge, he made a call. To the FBI. Marcus Reed had learned a hard truth early in his career. Bad cops don't get caught by accident. They have to be set up. That's exactly what he had done. Lauren Mitchell wasn't just a bad cop. She was careful, smart enough to avoid body cameras when things got ugly, tactical enough to file reports that justified her actions just enough to keep internal affairs off her back. Every complaint against her was dismissed. Every allegation was deemed unsubstantiated. Until now. For months, Marcus and the FBI's internal affairs team had been watching her, analyzing her patterns. The same type of stops, the same demographic, the same aggression. She wasn't just biased, she was predictable. And that's what made her easy to trap. The courthouse incident wasn't random. Marcus knew she would react the way she did. He knew she couldn't resist flexing her authority, especially when it came to black men who didn't submit the way she expected. She never asked him for ID immediately. She never asked him if he was armed. She never asked him if he had business in the courthouse. She assumed, just like always. That was all they needed. Marcus had walked into that courthouse with cameras already rolling. Agents had been stationed nearby, blending into the crowd. Some were dressed as attorneys, others as courthouse staff. Even a few uniformed officers had been briefed. Everyone was waiting for the moment she made her move. She had walked right into it. Now, standing face to face with her, Marcus remained unnervingly calm as he felt the weight of her hand hovering near her holster. Her eyes burned with frustration. He could see it in her posture. She wanted a reason to escalate, a reason to justify whatever she did next. He wasn't going to give her one. Slowly he reached into his pocket, knowing exactly what was coming next. "Don't move." Mitchell's voice cracked through the hallway like a whip. Gasps erupted around them. The tension shifted in an instant. Marcus froze, his hand still halfway to his wallet. The air around them felt charged, waiting for the next move. A lawyer dropped his files. A security guard stepped forward. The whole hallway had gone silent. Mitchell's fingers twitched near her gun. This was it. And then Marcus moved, deliberate, controlled, measured. He pulled out a sleek black wallet, flipping it open with precise intent. The gold badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. Silence. Mitchell's eyes flickered down, barely absorbing the details before snapping back up. But Marcus saw it. That split second where the color drained from her face. She knew, but she wasn't backing down. Marcus gave her a small, knowing smile. "Go ahead, Officer Mitchell," he said smoothly. "Make your next move." The hallway had gone eerily silent. The moment Lauren Mitchell saw the FBI badge in Marcus Reed's hand, something shifted in the air. The power she had wielded seconds ago, the authority she had relied on to control every situation, was slipping through her fingers. She knew what this meant, and yet she refused to back down. Her grip tightened on her belt as her mind raced, searching for a way to flip the situation in her favor. Deny, control, attack. Those were the tactics that had saved her before. "I don't give a damn who you work for," she snapped, her voice sharp but slightly unsteady. "If you refuse to comply with a lawful order, I can still detain you." Marcus didn't move. His expression didn't change. "A lawful order?" he repeated, his voice maddeningly calm. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell, exactly what law have I broken?" She clenched her jaw, refusing to let the growing crowd see her hesitate. But she had no answer, and Marcus knew it. The murmurs in the hallway grew louder. Phones were out, recording every second. People weren't just watching anymore. They were documenting. Mitchell turned slightly, scanning the room for backup. That's when she saw him. Special Agent David Monroe. Tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit, his presence alone shifted the energy in the hallway. Several uniformed officers who had been standing by, unsure of what to do, straightened as he stepped forward. His badge flashed, just enough for everyone to see. Mitchell's stomach twisted. Monroe's voice was smooth but firm. "That's enough, Officer Mitchell." Mitchell's pulse pounded in her ears. No, this isn't happening. "This is an active law enforcement situation," she argued. "I have the right to—" "No, you don't." The words cut through her like a blade. Monroe took another step forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "Marcus Reed is an active FBI agent conducting an undercover operation. Right now, the only person violating protocol," he glanced at the cameras pointed in her direction, "is you." The crowd shifted, whispers turning into gasps. Mitchell's breath hitched. This was spiraling out of her control. And then Marcus spoke. "You walked right into it," he said softly. "Every move you made, every word you said, it's all on record." Mitchell's fingers twitched. She had spent her entire career on the other side of this moment. She had been the one calling the shots, dictating the story. But now she was the one on trial. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, finally, Monroe gave the order. "Officer Mitchell, step back and relinquish your weapon." Silence. Mitchell's world tilted. For the first time in her life, she had no control. And she knew this was only the beginning of her downfall. For the first time in her career, Officer Lauren Mitchell felt trapped. Her breathing was sharp and uneven as Special Agent David Monroe's words echoed through the courthouse hallway. "Step back and relinquish your weapon." Mitchell's fingers hovered over her holster. This isn't happening. Her instinct screamed at her to fight back, to control the situation, to flip the narrative. She had done it before, turned a bad stop into a lawful detainment, turned excessive force into necessary compliance. But this time, the cameras were rolling. The courthouse staff, the lawyers, the other officers, they were all watching. Wait. Mitchell's jaw tightened. She wasn't going down like this. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "I was doing my job. He was acting suspicious." "He's a federal agent," Monroe cut in, "and this is not up for debate." Mitchell clenched her fists. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. Then she noticed something worse than the cameras. Her fellow officers. Some of them, the ones she thought were loyal, were looking away. Others stood frozen, hesitant, unsure. The power she had always wielded, the blind support she had relied on, was crumbling. No one was stepping in to save her. Monroe extended his hand. "Your weapon and your badge, Officer Mitchell." A lump formed in her throat. Mitchell had arrested hundreds of people in her career. She had slammed cuffs onto wrists, forced men and women into the back of patrol cars, lectured them about accountability. Now it was her turn. Slowly, her fingers curled around the grip of her service weapon. Every movement felt surreal, like she wasn't in control of her own body. She unlatched the holster and pulled the gun out, slowly, carefully, before handing it over. Then, her badge. As soon as Monroe took it from her, the reality hit like a freight train. This was real. Mitchell was no longer a cop. The silence in the hallway was deafening. The weight of judgmental stares, whispers, the phone cameras still recording, crushed down on her. Then the next order came. "Turn around." Mitchell flinched. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. "No, no. This isn't how it ends." She turned, mechanically, stiffly, as a uniformed officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of cuffs. The familiar metallic click sent a jolt of rage through her. "You have the right to remain silent." Mitchell clenched her jaw. She had heard those words 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never directed at her. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras clicking with every movement. Lawyers whispered to their clients. Officers, some in uniform, others in plain clothes, sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. And at the center of it all, Lauren Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, her face stony and unreadable. She had walked into the courthouse hundreds of times before, always with authority, always in control. Now, shackled and facing a judge, she was no longer the one handing out sentences. This time, she was the one being judged. The prosecution wasted no time. "This case is not about one bad decision," the lead prosecutor, Alicia Patel, said as she paced in front of the jury. "It's about a pattern, a history, a system that allowed Officer Mitchell to abuse her power for years without consequence, until today." The evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage was played, clips of Mitchell's unjustified stops, her aggressive tactics, the thinly veiled racial bias in her voice. Then came the witnesses. One after another, people took the stand. A young black man who was tackled and arrested by Mitchell for looking suspicious outside his own apartment building. A fellow officer, hesitant but firm, who testified that Mitchell often bragged about knowing how to keep them in line. A former police captain who admitted that complaints against her had been buried to avoid controversy. Then, the most damning testimony of all, her former partner, Officer Daniel Murphy, the man who had once laughed at her jokes, once defended her actions, walked to the stand. His hand shook slightly as he took his oath. "I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I was scared." We all were. A murmur rippled through the room. Mitchell's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for, the verdict. The jury foreperson, an older black woman with sharp eyes, stood and unfolded the paper. On the charge of misconduct in public office, guilty. A heavy silence. On the charge of unlawful detainment, guilty. Mitchell's stomach churned. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. Her hands clenched into fists. The courtroom erupted, some in whispers, others in hushed gasps. The judge's voice cut through the noise. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Mitchell sat motionless. She had spent years believing she was untouchable. Now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Across the room, Marcus Reed watched. This wasn't just about Lauren Mitchell. This was about every officer who thought they could never be held accountable. And as Mitchell was led away in cuffs, he knew this was only the beginning. The news spread like wildfire. Former police officer Lauren Mitchell, found guilty on all charges. Systemic corruption under federal investigation. Breaking, FBI expands inquiry into police misconduct. For days, headlines dominated every major news outlet. Social media exploded with discussions, debates, and outrage. Some called Mitchell's conviction justice overdue, others claimed she was a scapegoat, but one thing was undeniable: change was coming. And Marcus Reed wasn't done yet. He watched from the sidelines as city officials scrambled. Under pressure from federal oversight, the mayor announced a full review of law enforcement policies. The police chief resigned within 48 hours. Internal Affairs reopened dozens of old cases. Officers who once turned a blind eye were suddenly cooperating, feeding investigators names, documents, and hidden reports. The blue wall of silence? It was cracking. A week after the verdict, Marcus sat in a dimly lit FBI office, staring at the files spread out before him. Lauren Mitchell had been one of many. Her conviction was a warning, but she wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Special Agent David Monroe stepped in, tossing a new file onto Marcus's desk. "You ready for the next one?" Marcus opened it. The name on the report made his stomach tighten. Detective Ryan Calloway. Another officer, another pattern of abuse, another name that thought the badge made him untouchable. Marcus let out a slow breath, then nodded. Let's get to work. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Justice is not automatic. It's earned. This story isn't just about Lauren Mitchell. It's about a system that has protected people like her for too long. For years, she abused her badge, believing she was untouchable. And for years, the system allowed it. But eventually, accountability caught up with her. This case proves that change is possible, but it doesn't happen on its own. It takes people willing to expose corruption, willing to speak out, and willing to demand justice. Lauren Mitchell's conviction wasn't just about one officer. It was a warning to every cop who thinks they can get away with abuse. And while this may have been a victory, the fight isn't over. There are more officers like Mitchell, more cases waiting to be uncovered, more work to be done. So now, I ask you, what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think justice was truly served? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone abused their authority? How did you react? Drop your comments below, let's talk about it. And if you believe in holding power accountable, make sure to like this video. Subscribe for more real stories that expose the truth. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because this is just the beginning.